Hey fishing friends, Keith here at Chicken Thigh Fishing. Today we are going to disassemble, clean, lubricate, and reassemble a Pro TI bait casting reel from Lew's Fishing. So let's get to it. Before we do, just a couple of quick tips for you that I include in all my reel cleaning videos. When you're going to disassemble a reel, I recommend having your phone available so you can take some photographs as you go along the way. That way, if you need to refer to something, if you're not quite sure of how it goes, you memorialized it in a photograph and you can see the orientation of the components as you go along. During the video, I'll point out some key places where you may want to take photographs. Secondly, I always recommend working on a movable work surface when you disassemble a fishing reel. The reason is because there's going to be a lot of parts and there's going to be a lot of small parts. You don't want to do that on your kitchen table or someplace else out in the open and not have the ability to move it if you need to. If you have to go somewhere or you otherwise have your project interrupted, you don't want to leave the stuff out in the open because a pet or a kid is going to come by and knock them around or grab them or play with them or something like that. And if you lose a part, you're going to be in a world of hurt. So I recommend using a movable work surface. That way, if you have to leave, you can pick it up, put it on top of the refrigerator, put it on top of a cabinet, basement, garage, whatever. Then when you're done doing what you're doing, you come back, you can resume your project. Always use a movable work surface, you won't regret it. And the last thing I would like to point out is you should always have a schematic available. Now typically when you buy a bait casting reel, you're going to have a manual which includes a schematic blow-up photograph of all the components of your reel. Sometimes you won't get that. For instance, if you buy a combo off the rack at Dick's Sporting Goods or something like that, your reel doesn't come in a box, you don't get a manual, you don't get a schematic of the components. If that's the case, all you got to do is go to the manufacturer's website, and as far as I know, on all of them you can download and print a schematic photograph of the components of your reel. So have that handy. It's always good to refer to that. I've done this 100 times and I still sometimes refer to the schematics if I have a question about the orientation of a component. So with that said, let's get cracking on this Pro TI reel. Now you're going to hear me refer to the palm side and the handle side of the reel. Palm side obviously is the side that goes in your palm. Handle side is obviously the side with the handle. So you'll hear me referring to those sides of the reel. That's what I am referring to. The first thing we're going to do is remove that palm side plate. And on the Pro TI, it's with a lever on the back side here. And you just click that little lever, and that will release the palm side plate so you can remove it. Once you have that palm side plate removed, of course you can access the spool and you can remove the spool. Now we're going to turn over to the handle side of the reel and we're going to remove the handle assembly, the star drag, and the handle side plate. The first order of business to get this handle off is the handle nut retainer screw. And so we'll unscrew that. After the handle nut retainer screw is the handle nut retainer, and that will typically fall off from gravity. If it doesn't come off like that, sometimes it's stuck there with grime or oil or anything. All you have to do is grab a small screwdriver and pop that off, and it will easily come off. Next is the handle nut. Now, a very important thing you want to pay attention to regarding the handle nut on a bait casting reel. Depending upon whether or not you are left-handed or right-handed, depends on the way you turn it. If you are right-handed and the reel is on the right-hand side of your reel, there's no difference than anything else. However, if you're a lefty like me, that is to say that the handle is on the left side of your reel, the nuts are reversed. So you're not going to turn it left to loosen it, you're going to turn it right to loosen it. And that's important because if you turn it the wrong way and you crank into that at all, this nut can strip very easily. So I'm going to use a 10mm wrench, or you can use a small adjustable wrench if you have that available. And I am going to turn this to the right to loosen it. And all I got to do is crack it. And then I can easily remove that as well as the handle. Now when you remove a handle, it's important to note that there is always going to be a washer of some sort beneath the handle. If you look and the washer is not right here above the star drag on the main gear shaft, that's because it is stuck to your handle. Typically when you have a dirty reel or you haven't taken it down in a long time, that's going to stick here. So if you don't see the washer here, it's right here, and you just peel it off and you're all set. In this case, I have the handle washer here on the main gear shaft, and I'm just going to lift that off and put that aside. Now next we have the star drag, and removing the star drag is simply a matter of spinning it off the main gear shaft. So I'm going to spin this to the right to loosen it because it's a left-handed reel. And that should just spin off for you. After we have the star drag removed, we're going to get into our series of washers on the main gear shaft. So we're going to want to remove those washers and keep them in the same orientation that we removed them in. And the reason that is important is because these two washers are curved washers. One of them curves this way and the other one curves this way, and they have to go back in the same orientation. So when you remove them from the main gear shaft, you want to keep them that way. When you clean them, you want to keep them that way, and then when you replace them, you want to keep them that way. If they are inverted, it can affect the way that your reel performs. Now on the Pro TI, underneath the curved washer, you're going to find another washer, and then another one under that. There's a pair of thinner washers. Following the washers is going to be the sleeve, and now the sleeve slides down over the main gear shaft. In many cases, you can remove the sleeve by grabbing it or just tapping it out a little bit so you can grab it with your hand. However, if you cannot grab it with your hand and pull it out, which sometimes occurs if the reel is extra dirty or something like that, or if you simply just can't get your fingers in there to grab that sleeve off, it's not a big deal because you can get that sleeve easily when we do the next step, which is removing the handle side plate. The reason I bring it up is because in the event that you don't take it out here and it falls out at some point, you know where it came from. So let's go ahead and now remove the handle side plate. Now, different than the palm side plate, which is released by that lever mechanism, the handle side plate is secured by screws, and you will have a screw on the outside and 3 screws on the inside on a Pro TI reel. Now, one of the screws on the inside part of the housing doesn't only hold the main body of the reel to the handle side plate, but it also secures the lubrication port door. So when you remove that screw, that's also going to loosen the port. And you're going to want to remove that port door. And the reason is, if you remove that screw but leave that door in place, you won't be able to lift the handle side plate off of the body of the reel. So now that I have those screws removed, you can see that I laid them out in the pattern that I removed them. This screw goes on the exterior side, and these screws go here, 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 and here with the lubrication port door. And you want to keep them oriented in the same way you put them back in. That just makes it much easier when it comes time for reassembly, because as you will see, you have different size screws. If you get them all mixed up, you're going to waste time when it comes time for reassembly and trying to put the wrong screws in the wrong holes. So I recommend laying them out in the pattern that you remove them. And that way, when you remove the handle side plate, you can simply put it down and the screws are in the pattern that you're going to return them to. Now back to that sleeve we were talking about. If you can't get that sleeve out by tapping it in the beginning before you remove this handle side plate, it's either going to remain on the main gear shaft like this, you can see it here, or it's going to remain stuck in the clutch here. If it remains stuck in the clutch, it's simply a matter of pushing it through and taking it out. In this case, it remained on the main gear shaft, so I'm going to remove it and place it over here. And now I can take my handle side plate and place that over here along with the screws. Now, one thing to note on this sleeve is when you look at this sleeve, at first glance, it appears to have identical ends, but it does not. One end has two straightened sides inside the circle. The other end is completely circular. The end with the two straightened sides, it's like an oblong rectangular shape, goes up, and the circular side goes down on the gear shaft. That's going to be important to remember when it comes time for reassembly. Now at this point, I would recommend taking a photograph. It's always good to get a photograph of the internal components so you have a record of where things are when they are positioned correctly. That way, when you reassemble, if you put something in the wrong direction or upside down or something just doesn't look right to you, you can refer to that photograph you just took. And you can also refer to your schematic components plan, but a photograph works wonders if you end up making a mistake. Now, you shouldn't really make a mistake because this is easier than it looks. And once you do this a couple times, you're going to be a pro at it. The first thing we're going to remove from here are the springs on the yoke posts. There are two springs that go on these posts, and all you have to do is remove them and lay them aside. Next, we are going to remove the pinion gear and the yoke. And in order to remove that, you may have to just tilt the main gear a little bit in order to get the clearance to remove that. And then you will have the yoke and the pinion gear. You will notice it has a wider side and a thinner side. That wider side goes down into the gear hole. You will also see that the middle of the pinion gear has a smaller diameter than the gear ends. That's what marries into the yoke, and that's how that goes in and out. Which now enables us to remove the main gear and drag washer assembly, and you should be able to just lift that up. If you're not able to simply lift that up and it requires a little bit of force for you to break it free, that's fine, and sometimes that happens depending on how dirty your reel is or whatnot. Just make sure you do that under control so you don't yank it off there, because you would send some washers flying and that would cause you a problem. So I'm going to lift that off there, and when you lift that main gear off there, you should always put your finger underneath it, because 9 times out of 10 there are going to be components stuck to the bottom of your main gear. And in this case, you will see that I have my ratchet and a washer stuck to the main gear. And the reason they stick there is from the oil and the grease inside the reel, and also from the dirt and grime that gets in there. So if you lift this main gear up, you always want to sandwich all the pieces together so they don't fall down and then you're not quite sure of the order. This just helps you keep them in order without referring to your components chart. If they're not stuck there, they will simply be on the main gear shaft. So we have the ratchet and a washer, and now I'm going to work from the other end and take out the components from the top of the main gear, which is going to consist of a series of washers, both metal and carbon fiber. And you'll see that that carbon fiber one's stuck to this eared washer. and they are usually alternating from metal to carbon. And I will lay those out in the order that they go in. Now, one very important thing to note when you take apart this assembly is the ratchet. You will notice that the ratchet has teeth that go in one direction. The proper orientation of that ratchet is to have those teeth going to the left. It's very easy when you're cleaning it to invert it in such a way that the teeth are facing towards the right, and that would be incorrect upon reassembly because those teeth need to engage with the kick lever. And you can see that if I put this on with the teeth facing the wrong way, it's not going to be able to engage with the end of the kick lever. And so they have to face this way. So you just want to pay attention to that, so when you lay it down, it's in the correct orientation. When you pick it up and clean it, and then when you reassemble, it's in the correct orientation. I have put that on wrong before, and you have to take apart your whole reel again and get all the way down there simply to flip that ratchet over if you put it on the wrong way. No big deal, but a pain in the butt. After we have the drag washer and main gear assembly removed, you may want to take another photograph so you can see the parts that were lying underneath there. The next thing we are going to remove is the main gear shaft, and that's held in by 2 screws. Now, an important thing on the Pro TI reel is that the Pro TI has a hook keeper. It's a spring-loaded hook keeper that slides here, and it's actually a very nice little feature, and I like it. Lew's has it on a few of their different models of reels. I haven't seen it on any other reels. So it just flips out so you can hook your lure or your hook to it when it's mounted on your rod. However, necessarily that requires a spring. On most reels, when you lift up this main gear shaft and bearing plate, you're not going to have any other parts attached to it. In this case, because of that spring, you will see the spring that controls that hook keeper is attached to a small hole in the bearing plate. Now you want to be cognizant of that because you're going to take that spring out when you take that out. You want to be aware of that for 2 reasons. It's small. If you don't see it and it falls, see you later, bye. It's gone. Number 2, you want to make sure of the orientation of it. Now the orientation is very easy. One side has a 90-degree angle that goes into the hook keeper itself, and the other side has kind of a looped end which loops through this little hole in the bearing plate. So in order to remove that main gear shaft and bearing plate, we're going to remove those 2 screws. And once I have those 2 screws removed, I can remove the main gear shaft and the bearing plate. And so there you will see this spring. And I'm just going to remove that so I don't lose it. So you will see on the spring that it has a 90-degree angle on one end, and it has kind of a hook on the other end. The hook goes into the hole on the bearing plate, and that 90-degree angled end fits into this little slot next here to this screw for the hook keeper. Now when you remove the main gear shaft, it's going to have the lower gear and the bearing plate on it. Now you can remove these components and clean them separately, but you don't need to. You can sufficiently clean them keeping it together, and I always like to break down a reel to as few parts as necessary. So in this case, I just leave this unit as a whole, and I remove it, clean it, and replace it as a whole. Underneath the main gear shaft, you will find a bearing that you're going to want to remove, and that sits right in that pocket down there. And so I'm going to put that right with the main gear shaft. Now that's as far as we're going to break down the handle side. You do not need to break down all these different components here. You certainly can if you want to. However, it's not necessary to achieve a sufficient cleaning and lubrication, so I would leave those parts intact. The next thing we're going to move to is the front of the reel that includes the level wind, the worm drive, the pillar, and the hood. Now, in order to begin disassembly of this section, we're going to remove the hood. Now, the hood is secured by a screw on either side, so we're going to remove those screws, but we're going to be cognizant of which screw goes on which side of the hood. So the reason you want to take note of which side they come off of is because oftentimes those two screws are different sizes. So I always keep it oriented with the reel facing me, so I know this one goes on the left hand side and this one goes on the right hand side with the reel facing me. And once those two screws are removed, I can simply remove the hood. And we're going to put this spring back over here so we know it goes with the main gear shaft. Now once you remove the hood, you are going to remove the pillars. Now on the Pro TI reel there are two pillars. On most reels there are one. On the Pro TI there are two. One of them goes through the level wind guide. But you want to be cognizant that this is going to be the next step, because once you remove the hood is what keeps those pillars in place. So when you remove that hood, they can easily fall out. Now all you have to do to remove those pillars is kind of manipulate them so that the end comes out. And you'll see that I'm starting to remove that one out. Now I'm going to keep this in the orientation that helps me put it back together, so I have the reel facing me. So I'm going to take out the front pillar that goes through the level wind guide, and I'm going to take it out and lay it down in the same way that I'm going to put it back in. And now the second pillar is right behind it, and you should be able to loosen that with gravity. And again, I'm going to lay it down the way it comes out. Now you will see that the level wind gear is able to move. However, it's not disengaged from the worm drive yet, because under this cap is a pawl that engages it with that worm drive. So you're just going to want to remove that cap, and if it's too tight to do by hand, it's got a slot for a screwdriver. And you're going to go ahead and remove that cap. Now there is a spacer in here, and usually it will be on top of the pawl there, or it will stay stuck inside the cap when you remove it. In this case, it's inside the cap. So in order to remove the pawl that engages with the worm drive, I'm just going to use gravity and dump that out in my hand. Now once that pawl is out, you can see that the level wind is no longer engaged with the worm drive, and it is free to move back and forth and front and back. However, we can't remove that level wind guide until we remove the worm drive tube and the worm drive. Now when it comes time to that, we're going to disassemble both sides. On the handle side, you're going to have a gear that's held in by a pin. And on the palm side, you're going to have an E-clip to remove that holds it all together. In order to be able to get to these parts, the first thing is to remove that E-clip. Now the E-clip is small, and all you need to do is take a pointed implement or a small screwdriver and get it into one of the notches on the E-clip. Once you get it in there, you're able to pop it off. However, you want to be sure to cup this with your hand when you do that, because when you pop that E-clip off, it has a propensity to want to go flying across the room. If it does, good luck finding it. So once you get your implement into the notch there, just cover it with your hand. And when I popped that off, it bounced off my hand, but it just went down into the housing, and you can see that I can dump it out there. Now when I disassemble these components for this part of the reel, I'm going to lay them all out in the orientation that they're in with the reel facing me, so I'm very clear on the way they go back in. So underneath that E-clip, you're going to find a spacer. And you just pop that spacer off and put that with the E-clip. Underneath the E-clip will be a plastic bushing. And all you're going to do is pop that out. And you will notice on this bushing that it has a rectangular nub that sticks out of one side of it. Now that marries with the molding of the body of the reel, and that can only go in one way. So when you reassemble it, you're going to want to put that rectangular nub right where it goes. Now there's one more component under there, which is a bearing, but you usually can't get that out until you remove the worm drive from the tube. So we're going to move over to the handle side of the reel, and now that this is loose, I am able to move the worm drive tube out. And as I pull it out, you're going to see that I'm going to be able to access the level wind guide. So as I pull out the worm drive tube, I'm going to go ahead and grab the level wind guide. Now the level wind guide has the large hole for the worm drive tube. It has the small hole for that front pillar. On the front, it has the lower hole, which accommodates the pawl and the spacer and the cap. And the top hole, of course, is your line guide, and that's where your line goes out and comes in on the reel. So now we're going to go back to the gear side of the worm drive. And now that it's loose, I am able to lower the worm gear off the pin. And you will see that very small pin in there. And all you have to do is grab that pin or tap it out in your hand. And you can see how small that pin is. Now that pin sits inside the grooves that are on top of the worm drive gear. And it's shaped in a cross pattern so it can go either way when it comes time for reassembly. But you just want to make sure that you understand that the grooves go up because the other side is flat. So we'll put the worm drive gear along with the worm drive gear pin, and now we are ready to remove the worm drive from the tube. Now once you do, you're going to get to a bearing on this side, and you should be able to easily remove the bearing. Then you can remove the rest of the worm drive from the worm drive tube. Now there's still another bearing from the handle side of the reel. So what we're going to do is just pop that one out, and we know that goes under the gear. And so now you have the worm drive and the worm drive tube, and you want to be cognizant of the fact that it only goes in one way. It will not fit in the other way. So another way to remember it, other than the fact that it simply won't go in the other way, is that there is a hole on the handle side of the worm drive that accommodates the pin that secures the gear. So you know that the side of the worm drive with the hole goes this way. So I'm going to lay that down just like that, and then I have the worm drive tube. And the worm drive tube can fit in the hole that accommodates it from either side, but you want to remember that it's going to go in this way upon reassembly. And the reason for that is one end is lipped and the other end is not. You want the lipped end on the handle side, on the gear side of the reel. And that is because that lip forms a cup that the bearing goes into, and then the gear sits on top of it. So when it comes time for reassembly, the worm drive tube is going to go in from the right to the left on this reel. That is to say, from the handle side toward the palm side. And so now I have all these components arranged with the reel facing me. I have these components arranged in the exact orientation that they are going to be replaced in. I have the back pillar, the front pillar, the worm drive tube. On the palm side of the reel, I have the bearing, the bushing, the spacer, and the E-clip. And on the handle side, the gear side of the reel, I have the bearing, the gear, and the pin. So now that's as far as we're going to break this reel down. There is no need to break it down any further for routine maintenance, cleaning, and lubrication. You certainly can if you like. I don't recommend it. The parts get smaller and there are more of them. This is the extent to which you need to break down a reel to effectively clean it. So now what I would do is clean the parts individually here, and I would do it methodically and pick them up and clean them and place them back down in the same orientation that they are in. However, you'll notice my reel is not dirty, and the reason for that is because I already disassembled and cleaned it and then realized I should do a video on it, and so it's already cleaned and oiled and greased, so I'm not going to go through the process of cleaning them again. Now, if you ask 100 people what they use to clean reels, you'll probably get 100 different answers. What I typically use is Lysol or Clorox wipes or any type of cleaning wipe like that. Those work sufficiently for me. They get all the dirt and the grime and the gunk off the components of your reel. You can use whatever you want, whatever you find effective for cleaning your reel parts. So that being said, I don't have to clean the parts, so we're going to go ahead and reassemble. Now when I reassemble, it's going to be with the front of the reel facing me, with the body of the reel and the front of it facing me. And so that way I have the correct orientation of all the parts we have to start with. So we're pretty much going to go in reverse order from our disassembly. That being said, the first thing we're going to put in is the worm drive tube. Now you remember the lipped edge goes on the gear side of the reel. So I'm going to stick it through this hole and put it about halfway through so I am able to put the level wind on it. Now again, the big hole on the level wind is for the worm drive tube. So for the other end of the worm drive tube, you just want to make sure you seat that into the other side and the corresponding hole on the other side of the reel, and you can usually feel and hear that click into position. Now next will be the worm drive itself, and again the end with the hole goes on the gear side of the reel so that pin can go into it, but the drive only goes in this way, it doesn't go in the other way. So we're going to stick that through so that the end with the hole protrudes, and now I can assemble the gear side components of the worm drive, beginning with the bearing, and now you recall the bearing fits into the cup on the lipped edge of the worm drive tube. After the bearing is the gear, and you want to make sure the grooves that the pin goes in are facing up. And so you just have to make sure that there's enough clearance there where you can see the hole, giving you the ability to insert that pin. Once you get that pin through the hole, you're just going to want to manipulate it down so that the pin goes into the grooves on that gear. You're just going to kind of turn it a little bit and manipulate it. And then once it goes in there, you'll see that the end of the worm drive and the pin are in flush with the gear. And once you get them flush, you're going to want to cover that with your finger, because when you tip it over to the other side, if you don't hold that with your finger, the gear and the pin will likely fall out. So I'm going to hold that in place while I move over to the palm side. Now on the palm side, you recall we have the bearing, and then the bushing. And you're going to make sure that that rectangular nub on the bushing is facing the correct direction and seats perfectly into the molding of the reel. You want to try to get as much of this worm drive sticking up as you can, because it's going to have to accommodate the spacer and then the E-clip. So I'm going to replace that spacer, and then I am going to take the E-clip and get that into position to pop it on. Now once I have that E-clip in position, I'm going to take a small slotted screwdriver and put a little bit of pressure on it so it holds it in position. And once I have pressure on it, I can let go of the bottom, and then I can simply pop the E-clip on. But just like when we removed it, you want to make sure you cup that with your hand, because in the process of popping that on, if it misses or if you move your hand a little bit, it could go off to the side and go flying across the room, and you don't want that. So once I have my screwdriver in position to pop it on, I'm going to cover it up and simply pop it on. And you'll see that it is now on the end of the worm drive. So now we have the worm drive secured on the palm side and on the gear side. And you'll see now that the level wind is still free. So now we're going to go ahead and engage the level wind with the worm drive. And the way we're going to do that is with the pawl. Now the pawl has two ears on it, and the ears go down. So you're going to drop that into the hole, and you'll notice when you do, it's usually sticking up past the edge of it. What you're going to do is rotate the worm drive by moving the gear, and what will happen is those ears will find the grooves in the worm drive and will drop down into it, and that's how that pawl engages with the worm drive. You can then replace the cap, and you can snug that down with a screwdriver, but you don't want to go crazy tightening it because it's only plastic. And now you'll see that the level wind guide is engaged with the worm gear, because I can't move it side to side. I can still move it back and forth though. So how we're going to secure that is with the pillars, and we are going to replace the pillars now. Now you will remember that the pillars only go in one way. Now the reason that they only go in one way is because there is a nub on one end that is a smaller diameter than the rest of the shaft. So the hole on this side is bigger than the hole on this side, because this side allows the whole shaft to go through, and this side is smaller and it allows the nubbed end to seat into it. So we're going to take the front one and we're going to go through the hole on the side of the body of the reel, and then we're going to go through the smaller hole on the level wind guide, and then we're going to manipulate it so it is seated with the nub into this side of the reel. Now we're going to do the same thing with the back pillar, except the difference with the back pillar is it doesn't go through the level wind guide, it just goes behind it. So again, you just have to manipulate that into place to make sure that the nubbed end is seated into the corresponding hole on the other side. And the back one can be a little bit more difficult to get into position because, of course, it's not going through the level wind guide, which straightens it out. So you may have to take and kind of guide that in with a screwdriver, like so. Now once you get those pillars seated, you want to cover them with your finger because they will fall out. And you know you have them incorrectly when the ends of them that have the nubs are flush with the housing. So you want to keep your finger on that, otherwise they will fall out. Now that we have those in, you can see how the level wind guide is engaged with the worm drive by means of the pawl, and that's what allows it to move back and forth across the face of the reel, and that's what evenly winds your fishing line onto the face of your spool. So I still have my finger holding the two pillars in place so they don't fall out, and what holds those in place is the hood, and so we're going to replace the hood. The ear on the hood will keep those in place. So we're going to carefully put the hood back on, and you'll see that when I slide that back on, it slides over the ends of those two pillars, and so now that will hold it in place so those pillars won't fall out. So now we're going to replace the screws, and if you remember, we have one on the left and one on the right for the hood, but I want to make sure I'm holding it towards myself, and I want to make sure I put the correct one in the correct side. So I'm going to put the screw on inverted on the edge of my screwdriver. Since it's so small, I find it easier that way. So now when it comes to these hood screws, you don't want to tighten them down too tight because that hood is just plastic. So now we have the worm drive, the pillars, the level wind guide, and the hood replaced. Next we are going to put the main gear shaft and bearing plate back on. First thing that goes in is the bearing. And by the way, since I wasn't cleaning and lubricating this, every time you put a bearing in, you want to hit that with a drop of real oil. But I didn't do that on the bearings on the worm gear and on the worm drive because they've already been lubricated. So now I am going to take the main gear shaft, and it's going to go back in like this. But before I do, I'm going to take that spring that goes to that hook keeper. And if you recall, the hooked side goes on this hole on the bearing plate, and the 90-degree angle goes in this very small hole on the hook keeper. So in order to have that 90-degree angle facing down, I'm going to have that hook facing up. So I'm going to have to come through the underside of that hole on the bearing plate that it goes into. Once I get the curved end into the hole on the bearing plate, I'm going to insert the 90-degree end into the hole on the hook keeper, and then I'm just going to manipulate, while holding it in place, I'm going to manipulate the gear shaft and the bearing plate into place. Like so. So now you will see that the 90-degree end of that spring is in the hole on the hook keeper, and when I move the hook keeper in and out, you'll see that it moves with it. And I have the lower main shaft gear in place so it meshes with the worm drive gear. And so I will have the holes for the screws on the bearing plate lined up. And so now I'm going to take the screws for the bearing plate, and I'm going to hold the shaft in place like this when I pick it up. So now with the spring in place and the bearing plate in place, the next thing I'm going to put in is the pinion gear and the yoke. It has the wider side and the thinner side. The wider side goes down. We're going to fit the middle of the pinion gear into the yoke, and we're going to sit the yoke on top of the yoke posts. Now you'll see here that the yoke posts stick out quite a bit, and that's to accommodate the springs. So in the event that you put this yoke on and there's not an amount of that post sticking out and it's flush with the yoke, you know that you put the yoke on upside down, and all you have to do is flip it over. Because when you put it on correctly, the posts are going to stick up through and allow you to put these springs on. And now you want to make sure you remember to put the springs on. On multiple occasions over the years, I have put these springs off to the side during cleaning, put my whole reel together, only to see two springs sitting on my cookie sheet when I'm done, and then I have to disassemble all the way just to put those springs on the posts. So make sure you put the springs on the posts. And now we can move toward the main gear and drag washer assembly. So the first thing that's going to go on is that ratchet with the teeth facing to the left, and you'll see that there's an oblong rectangular shape in the middle of the ratchet, and that seats onto the base of that main gear shaft. So you're going to drop that into place and make sure that it seats into that rectangular shape. And you're going to make sure those teeth again are facing to the left so they can properly engage with the kick lever. Next comes the carbon fiber washer and the main gear. Now when you put the main gear down, it may not be able to slide right onto the pinion gear without you tipping the pinion gear a little to allow it enough clearance to go down. So all you got to do is tip that pinion gear, and then you will see that they mesh perfectly. So now we're going to continue with the drag washers. And now we have the main gear and drag washer assembly in place. Now here is where I would grease the main gears. I put a little film of grease on. I'm not going to put any more on because I already did, and you don't need a lot of grease for a reel. So now next we are going to replace the handle side plate. And that's simply a matter of putting it in place, and you might feel a little bit of tension from those two springs. But once you get that in place, you can then replace the screws. So you remember this screw goes on the outside. And now we will go to the screws for the back side, and we will put them back in the same pattern that we removed them. And these holes on the inside can be a little bit difficult to get to, so you just want to make sure you get them in there. And the last screw will be for that lubrication port door, so we'll replace the door so it's flush. And then we'll get that screw in there. So now with the handle side plate on, we can reassemble the washer assembly. Starting with the sleeve washer, and remember the side with the two straight sides with the rectangular opening goes up, the circular opening goes down. So you're just going to stick that on your main gear shaft and get it right down there into the clutch. We're going to replace the washers in the same order that we removed them. We're going to keep those curved washers in the correct orientation so they are curved in the right way. And once those are in position, we are ready for the star drag. Now the star drag, since it's a left-handed reel, is going to be left to tighten. And when you get that on there, you want to make sure it spins very easily and freely like that. When you put the star drag on, if there's any resistance whatsoever, stop what you're doing, take it off again, and start over. Sometimes that first thread, because of the shape of the inside of that star drag, can be tough to get on, but it should go on super easy like that. If there's any resistance, start over. You don't want to strip that. So you're going to bring that down, and you're going to get to a point where when you spin it, it engages and it starts to move the level wind guide and the worm drive. So all you have to do to get it the rest of the way on is to hold that in place with your fingers. And now you can hear it engage with the click washer in there. And you can get that down the rest of the way. So now we're going to go ahead and put the handle washer on. And then the handle. And by the way, this is a washer here that I forgot about when we took it apart, and it goes on the top. So this reel has a handle washer above and beneath the handle. So we're just going to stick that on. And once we have the handle in place, we can replace the handle nut, and again it's going to be left to tight. And again, sometimes it can take a minute to get that first thread on there because of the shape of it. And so as long as it's going on easily, you know you've got it on correctly. Just like the star drag, if there's any resistance, stop and start over. So once I get that hand tightened, I'm going to take my 10mm wrench and I'm going to snug it down Not going to go crazy, just snugging it down. You don't want to over tighten your handle nut. And so once you have that handle nut in place, the next thing is going to be the handle nut retainer. And you're going to want to put that on so that the hole in the handle nut retainer lines up with the hole in the handle to put the screw in. Now you're probably not going to be able to get that on exact. So once you do, you're just going to tweak the handle to the left or the right a little bit in order to line it up. And once you have that lined up, you can go ahead and insert the handle screw. Now we're all set on this side, and we can move over to the palm side of the reel. And prior to installing the spool, we'll put a drop of oil on the worm gear and a drop in on the pinion gear. The spool will have a bearing for a drop of oil. And you can go ahead and insert that. Once the spool is in, your last component will be your palm side plate, which usually also has a bearing in it if it has a magnetic external dial. And you can go ahead and replace that, click it into place. Good to go. So there you have it. Clean, quiet, smooth, ready for action. Hey folks, I hope this video was a help to you if you own a Lew's Pro TI reel. If you liked the video, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. Thanks for being a part of Chicken Thigh Fishing, and we'll see you on the next video. Until then, stay fishing, my friends.